Charlamos con Bev Vincent, escritor, autor de libros como The Road to Dark Tower, The Dark Tower Companion, esa obra espectacular, llena de reproducciones de inéditos de King y originales, que fue de Stephen King Illustrated Companion. En fin, Bev trabajó junto a King, han colaborado, han sido los curadores de Por los Aires, esa antología de cuentos que tienen que ver con aviones y cosas que pasan cuando andas por el aire. Es amigo del rey, en fin, lo han invitado a la casa, tiene más proyectos junto a él, se recomiendan películas. Es más, hasta una vez, sin que él lo pidiera, King le mandó un guión suyo para que opinase qué le parecía. El chabón es un faro, a ver, yo le presto mucha atención porque realmente es una de esas personas que realmente saben y saben en serio sobre King. Con lo cual, la oportunidad de poder charlar junto a él durante 1 hora y media fue espectacular. Nos contó de todo, lo vas a ver a continuación. Realmente te decimos, te lo recomendamos, no te la pierdas. Antes de comenzar lo de siempre, acordate que a nosotros nos viene muy bien que vos te suscribas a nuestro canal de YouTube, que veas los videos, les des like, que compartas, que comentes. Al algoritmo le encanta y a nosotros nos permite seguir haciendo este tipo de contenido.
Hi, Bev. How are
Hello
you?
there. Very good, thanks. How are you?
All fine. Thank you very much for being here. It's really nice to talk to you. As I was saying off the record, I've known you for a long time and follow all your projects. And I know this, but our audience may not. And so my first and typical question would be, and when and how did you discover Stephen King works and later became, of course, a constant reader?
So I grew up in Eastern Canada in the province of New Brunswick, which is attached to Maine. We share a border. And so as a child, my family often went camping in Maine, and we were in Bangor many times. But this was in the 60s, so this was before Stephen King was known. I didn't discover his work until 1979, which was when I picked up a copy of Salem's Lot in a used bookstore. And I used to go to that bookstore every weekend. I was in university at the time, and I bought stacks of books all the time, mostly science fiction and fantasy in those days. But I grabbed Salem's Lot, and it was like an addictive drug. From the moment I read that book, I was hooked. And from there, I went back and read everything else that he had published, which in 79 was only a handful of books, but I became a constant reader from that point forward.
From the very beginning. I
From
mean,
the very beginning.
29, 5 years only. And
Yeah.
before Steve published more than one book every year, biking and all the stuff. Well, great. Have you ever returned to Silent Slot ever since? Did you read
Oh
it again?
yes. Oh yes, quite often. I don't think that there are many of his books that I haven't read many times. I remember specifically perhaps 15 years ago or so, I went back and reread all of the books in publication order.
For
Um, you
reciting.
know, yeah, which was an interesting, because then you start to see things. If you just read them randomly, sometimes you miss some of the connections or the callbacks or things like that. So that was interesting. And yeah, I dipped back into them. It's been a while, probably, for Salem's Lot. I don't know when the last time I read it was, but it's still top of mind. I could tell you much about it.
Um, Years passed
Yeah,
by,
definitely.
and you ended up working on books about Stephen King. The first one is, of course, Road to the Dark Tower. It's an in-depth analysis of the saga. I mean, book by book. And this one was published. Just Amazon says I cannot remember it was a month, but Amazon says it was only 1 week after that famous September 21st of 2004 when Stephen King published the last book of the Dark Tower. So you definitely read. I know the story, of course. That you read the last three books prior its publications. Can you tell us more about this book, how the project rose, and uh, I read that you got the manuscripts like 2 years before its publication.
So, I wrote a still write a column for Cemetery Dance magazine called News from the Dead Zone, which is King news and reviews and commentary. And as a result of that, people asked me, when I was going to write a book about King's work. And to me, that seemed like a project I couldn't wrap my mind around, because even at that point, which was the early 2000s, there were so many books that it seemed to me it would be like a lifetime's job. And so I always put that idea aside. And then when I heard that King was going to write the last 3 novels in the Dark Tower series back to back, I thought, well, here's a project that you can sort of wrap your arms around. It's not 30 books or 50 books, it's 7 books. And it's a series that has connections to so much of the rest of his fiction. And it also spans his writing career. He wrote the first lines when he was, 20, 21 years old. And this, all these years later. So I thought, okay, here's something that I can really grasp. It's not too big. And so I talked to Richard Chismar about it, the Cemetery Dance publisher, who was a good friend of mine, and he was very encouraging. And so I put together a proposal. But so I put together the proposal, and this is a long time ago, so I'm trying to remember the sequence. And a proposal. So when you do nonfiction books, typically you sell the book before you write it, where with fiction it's the other way around. So I put together a proposal, wrote a sample chapter, and then just sort of blindly submitted it to, first of all, to Steve's publisher. But they already had Robin Firth's book in the pipeline.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, who will be hungry for something like this? And I thought, well, what about Steve's previous publisher, the one who publishes the first 4 Dark Tower books? And I thought, this might be good. So I got some interest there. But at the same time, I queried Steve's office. And then back in those days, I communicated with them by fax. And so I sent a fax in and I said, I've got this idea for this book. If Steve hates the idea, just say so now and I'll put it to bed and I'll move on to something else. But then I said, but in my wildest dreams, I would love to have this book come out at around the same time as the 7th book is published. And is there any possibility that I could read these manuscripts? Just shot in the dark. If you don't ask, the answer is no. I just shot in the dark. And within a day or so, I got the response saying, Steve's okay with the project and the books are on the way. And so the very next day, or a couple of days later, I got this shipment of, it was 3 big boxes, 2,500 pages of printed manuscripts. As you said, 2 years before they were going to be published. So I didn't have to sign any documents. There was no non-disclosure agreements. There was nothing like that. There was just a sentence at the end of the response from his office saying, Steve knows where you live. So that was all I needed. His publisher was a lot more worried. I had to talk to her to reassure her that I wasn't going to divulge any things about the books before they were published, to the extent that even my editor, he wasn't able to read the Dark Tower books, the unpublished ones, until very late in the project. And then I got permission to send him a copy as well, so that he could edit my book with a little bit more information.
A context, right? Because he was like blind, if not. I remember reading an interview that you said that you only answered one question.
Just one question.
And it was
because I knew if I opened the door a little bit,
no.
then where do you stop? So I said, okay, I'll only answer one question. That is, how many pages are in the books?
Yeah, if you open the door, it was like The Walking Dead, basically. No chance to close it back.
Yeah, it's like inviting the vampires into the house.
That's right. You got the first draft of this manuscript of the last 3 volumes, right? Do you remember any particular passage or scene that got a major change between that first draft and the final book?
There were quite a number of changes. I got then the printed proofs as the books moved closer to publication. but for books 5 and 6, for the 7th one, the proofs came too late. So there are some quotes in The Road to the Dark Tower that are direct quotes from the manuscripts that aren't from the books. There are things that got changed. I don't know that I can remember anything really specific. I mean, mostly I was concerned about, actual wordings, and things always get reworded when they're revised in that. Nothing, I mean, there were some cuts, some sections that were cut, but nothing earth-shattering, I would say.
Yeah, I thought so. I know that The Gunslinger is your favorite volume, that you read it a lot of time. That do you remember exact passages from the novel? So I would like to know, in just a couple of words, what do you think of each of the volumes? Because, I mean, the first one has a really distinct tone. The drawing of the tree, I think it starts on the we call it here in Argentina on fifth engine. That's the last engine.
Definitely.
Posted.
Definitely.
So I would like to know how do you feel about each of the volumes in just a couple of words.
For a long time, The Gunslinger was the only one. I read it in '84, so there was nothing else. So, and you're right, I did read it a number of times. I loved it, and I still love it. And I know it's a difficult book for some people, but it's such a moody book, and Roland is so unlikable. He does some very bad things, and to carry a book with an unlikable character, I think is quite a feat. And then several years later, out comes The Drawing of the Three, which, as you say, shit happens really quickly. Things go bad very, very fast.
Yeah.
He loses fingers, and it's just like catastrophic. His ammunition is untrustworthy, and it's just like, how can you take a guy and make things really bad and then propel him forward? He's sick through a lot of the book, and it's a much more Stephen King-ish novel in terms of it's fantasy, but it's still sort of horrific.
Yeah.
The Wastelands is interesting because it starts off in a sort of a pause. It's him and Eddie and Susanna just taking a break, getting to know each other, getting up to speed, and then it tears off again. Then, oh my God, he leaves us in the lurch at the end on that train for 6-7 years.
Yeah.
Wow, what a cliffhanger.
So you had to wait for each. I mean, you're one of the readers that started with the first. So if someone knows about these waits, that's you.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it was terrible. And then you start to hear rumblings. Oh, he's working on it. Oh, it's going to come out next year. Well, maybe not till the year after that. And then there was, when Desperation and the Regulators came out, there was a little booklet that came with them, which had the first 2 chapters. He's got it there, yeah. And so it's really going to happen. And then a lot of people were taken aback by it, because a little bit of forward motion and then full stop, and we go back in time for 500 or 600 pages. It's a great story. It's a great backstory, but it's not what everybody was looking for.
That's my favorite.
And then again, Steve gets hit by a car in 1999 by a van, and everybody's saying, "Oh my God, he's never going to finish it." But then I think that was an incentive for him to, because of the way I read those books. To me, they're almost like one book, because I had the 3 manuscripts, just the big stack of paper, and I just sat there and I read pages. But anybody who likes the Westerns, the Magnificent Seven, and that, that influence is clearly there in Wolves of the Kala.
Yeah.
Song of Susanna is interesting because I'd actually read a section of that book even before, probably about 2001, 2002. So Steve had done this
the way
benefit.
Yeah,
he did this benefit thing in New York with Grisham and Straub and Pat Conroy, and I for the Wave Dancer thing, and I had come up with this idea that I could raise money for Wave Dancer by selling signed proofs of Everything's Eventual, which wasn't published yet, but it was galleys were out. And his editor, his publisher hated the idea, but Steve loved it, so it happened. And I got 7 or 8 copies of Everything's Eventual that he signed, and I sold them for about $1,000 each. And as a thank you for that, he sent me this little yellow tablet, like a legal pad, but a small-sized one. And he had flown to California to visit Frank Muller, who was the audio narrator who was very badly injured in a car accident. And while he was flying, he wrote the section by hand of Song of Susanna where Eddie and Roland meet Stephen King. And so he sent me that. It's like 10 or 12 pages of handwritten manuscript from that scene. So I knew that was coming. And then sort of worked my way back into it when I read the manuscripts. And then the last book, it's like, here we go. It's, everybody place your bets. It's this is what it's all about. I remember writing to him, we were on email by then, saying, you made me late for work. Because I got to about 150, 200 pages from the end, and I just couldn't stop. And so I just sat there and read that last section through to the end, and I was like an hour and a half late for work that day.
It was
Then
tough.
I had to go back and read it all over again. I mean, I don't know how many times I read the series during the year or so that I was working on the Road to the Dark Tower, but I read it a lot of times. And then I had to read it a number of times again when I did in 2010 the Dark Tower Companion. So yeah, I have. I don't know if they're behind
Yeah, I
me
saw
here.
them now.
Many highlights and sticky notes and things like that, because I'd go through them and I'd read them for the timeline, or read them for character, or read them for crossovers, and they're all colored different highlight colors.
I will get back to the Dark Tower very soon to talk, of course, about the Dark Tower Companion. I like what you mentioned about the item Steve King sent you with his writing on Song of Susanna, and I also read in a previous interview that you were I don't know if you still are a completist, that you try to seek for Stephen King early works in magazines and alike. Are you still a completist? And if so many years later, are you still after a certain item that you still didn't find?
No, I think I've pretty much got everything that I've been looking for. In the early days, like in the 80s when I had just discovered him, I wrote a letter, my first fan letter, and he sent back a little postcard response. But then he also sent, or his secretary sent, a letter that had his bibliography in it.
Nice.
And it had a list of all the interviews and all of the short stories and things like that. And I carried that in my wallet for years, finding, the issue of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine that had the wedding gig in it, or the science fiction and fantasy that had something else, and or some of the gentlemen's magazines that had the first printings of some of the stories that were in Night Shift. So yeah, I've still got that somewhere, and I photocopied it recently, but it's falling to pieces because it was folded and carried in my wallet and taken out so many times. But I lived in Eastern Canada in Halifax at that time, so my resources, it wasn't like I could go to New York or something where there was a lot more possibilities. So it took me a long time to find things. But over the years, I've gotten lots of everything that's been officially published, plus a bunch of things that have been unofficially published and passed around among the fan community, photocopies of things that have come out of the archives and stuff like that. So there's nothing that I'm really no needful thing, I would say.
All right. And if you had to choose, I don't know, the 3 most unique items you have, which one would this be? I imagine that Song of
So that
Susanna.
tablet's definitely one.
Yeah.
I've got a copy of the New Lieutenant's Rap.
Very nice.
Which was given out at the Carey 25th anniversary celebration. And I've got the 3 original copies of The Plant from back in the 80s. But I've got a really nice, it's one of the lettered editions of 6 stories that Steve gave me, and it's inscribed by Steve.
So we got first The Road to the Dark Tower. Then 5 years later, we got. I love this book so much. The Stephen King Illustrated Companion.
Yeah, I got to do that book because of The Road to the Dark Tower. The publisher called Becker and Meyer approached me by email and said that they called themselves book packagers. And to me, that sounded like a maybe suspicious thing, but it turns out that they're a kind of publisher who does very ornate books for other publishers. And they had seen my work in The Road to the Dark Tower. They sent me copies of other books they'd done. They had done a similar companion on Poe, one on Jane Austen, just very beautiful, very tactile books. And so as soon as I saw what they had, I said, yeah, absolutely. And I wrote it pretty quickly. I think it was something like 6 or 8 weeks.
Whoa.
And then we got there was a documents researcher who went out, spent some time in the archives and in University of Maine and got some of that stuff. And we got permission to reproduce. And then he went to a little place in northern Texas called Amarillo, where Bob Jackson, the super collector, lives. And Bob had all sorts of documents and letters and things from the Doubleday files, plus some of the campus literary magazines that Steve was published in, and so he let us reproduce some of that stuff too. So yeah, that's just been an amazingly well-received book.
Yeah, it was nominated for awards.
I've got my copies here, but there's not that many left.
It was also nominated for awards as well.
Yes. Yeah, it was nominated for the Stoker and for the Edgar Award for the mystery writers. Yep.
Of course, I love the fact that there are a couple of previously unpublished works by Stephen King that were reproduced there. Sorry, were there any certain or particular unpublished piece that you consider but couldn't be in the book because, I don't know, for example, Steve King prefer not to?
For that book, everything we asked for, we got. But in most cases, the documents researcher was in the library, and he was looking for things that mapped to the text, things that were significant to the text. And I didn't really guide him all that much. He would come back to me and he'd say, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And I sort of let things go in that direction. For the new book, which I think we'll probably talk about later on, it was a little bit of a different situation.
All right, we're gonna get there very soon. You mentioned in this book several of Stephen King early and unpublished works, such as, for example, his first novel, let's say, for The Aftermath. Did you read The Aftermath? Did you mention?
I have not, and that's actually something I asked for this time. I was hoping to be able to reproduce just the first page of it, but I think that the message got a little bit crossed, and I think they thought I was asking to read the whole thing.
All right.
And so that was denied. But I have read Rocky Wood's very detailed synopsis of the book, so I know what it's about, chapter by chapter, and I talk about it a little bit in the new book, but because there's some interesting King trademarks, I would say, even in that first book.
Yeah, great book, by the way, the one that Rocky Wood did, Stephen King, Unpublished and Collect.
Yeah,
very good one. It also reproduces one of the chapters of Sword in Darkness. So yeah, that's another one that probably will never be published. I learned. Did you read that one? Were you able to read that one?
No, but again, I know the chapter by chapter synopsis of it. He was encouraged to write that one by Terrell, his English professor, who had just finished reading The Long Walk, I believe. If not The Long Walk, then The Running Man. And yeah, I think it was The Long Walk, because he was saying, you should write something that's more topical, something current. And
Yeah.
so this was about race riots and the political turmoil of the 70s. And so I think it's very much a book of the 70s by somebody whose exposure to the 70s was limited to, small town Maine. So maybe setting something in a big city, it was a little bit beyond his scope. So it was probably a good exercise, but I don't think that he has much regard for it now.
Yeah, there is one thing. Of course, we as constant reader would like to read. I always joke that if Steve publishes next week his shopping list, I would probably buy it. Of
Well,
course.
he understands that too, and I mean, I don't think that it was by any coincidence that he wrote a book where part of the driving plot is people clamoring to have everything from an author who's just died. They want to loot his literary archives and get everything out of it. And I'm talking, of course, of Lisi's story and the Inkunks.
He nailed that one. He
Yeah.
nailed it so well. But again, of course, it's like the desire to read that one. But I read a lot of unpublished stuff by Steve, and I understand that it's not up to his current standards. That book. I mean, he wrote it when he was in his 20s, and I mean, probably it would be received like, "Oh, great! He's publishing an unpublished work from the early 70s," but still, it's not who he is now, right? The writer he's now. So
It'll be interesting to see what happens once his archives really get back up and running again. Because they're sort of in a stasis right now because of COVID. They were being transferred from the university to the house in Bangor. And, I was able to write in and request documents that they scanned and sent to me. But there's still not that sort of researcher access that there had been for so many years.
Yeah, when I visited Bangor in 2008, I contacted the university to have access to the Fogler collection, and I got a very polite response saying, "Okay, everything is a mess at this moment. We can have you have access to just 2 or 3 things because all the rest is not very organized at this moment, and we just cannot have the time to organize it. But if you want to come." At the end, I only visited Bangor for one day, and it was Saturday, so I said, "Okay, better luck next time. Thank you very much." And then, well, the archive now is moving to 47 West. So, time will tell. Yeah. So 2013, we had a great year for us. Talking about your books, about Stephen King. Of course, we're going to talk later on about your short stories and other essays out of the Stephen King works. We got the expanded edition of the Stephen King Illustrated Companion, and we also got the Dark Tower Companion, which was really insightful and clear guide of Stephen King's epic saga, of course. The Marvel comics were out, and I think that was like a peak moment for newcomers, for new people.
That's right.
Jump into the Dark Tower. And which challenge do you face writing this book compared to this one? Because, of course, this one is more like a tour guide for people that know the saga, and this one was a really great book for newcomers, people that hear about it, read the comics, but didn't jump in yet.
Yeah. So my assumption with The Road to the Dark Tower is you've already read the series, because I start spoiling it right out of the gate. My assumption with the Dark Tower Companion is you may or may not have read it. You may be reading it now, and you may want to know what this is, or you may have read the graphic novels. Or at the point when I was working on that, Ron Howard and Akiva Goldsman had their plans to make the Dark Tower series adaptation. So I thought there's going to be all these people who are going to know the Dark Tower from something other than the books. And I wanted to create a reference for them. But I was also fascinated by the process of creating the graphic novels, because, I grew up reading, a few comics, like Archie and, Donald Duck and things like that. But I was never a huge comic book reader. I didn't read most of the superhero things that a lot of my fellow writers grew up with. And so I wasn't aware of the process. And so one thing that's in the Dark Tower Companion is interviews with everybody who I could talk to who were involved in the process. So Robin Firth, of course, who wrote the sort of the Bible for it. And then Peter David, who wrote the scripts for the individual things. And then I found out, okay, well, there's somebody who goes in and sketches it out. And then there's somebody else who goes in and paints it. And then there's somebody else who goes in and writes the letters. And it's all different skills. And, to hear them talk about, well, we know that people are going to be reading the graphic novels who aren't necessarily comic book readers. And so we want to present these graphic novels in a very straightforward way, almost like letterbox movies, without too much, sort of abstract, bubbles and, pages that you have to learn how to read. Just finding all that stuff just fascinated me. So there's a lot of those interviews in there too. Plus, I was sitting at my office one day and my wife calls me and says, Ron Howard's going to call you. And so I got to talk to Ron Howard about their plans and Akiva Goldsman. And I was just astonished by how open they were about what their plans were. They told me so much about the big picture of how they imagined doing this, which was very revealing. And then I don't interview Steve all that often. I've done it, a handful of times, but I got him on the phone and I interviewed him for this book as well. There were a few things I wanted to worm out of him that he wouldn't tell me, but he did tell me some things that this is the only place where those details exist. And a lot of people don't notice them, like the fact that Roland had siblings.
Yeah, that was one of my questions.
And we even know who they are, who his sister is specifically. And so, of course, by that point, the Wind Through the Keyhole was out too, so we knew a little bit more about that period of Roland's mother's life too. So that was fun, getting that in there. And then a project that I always wanted to do, which I'd never gotten the chance to do, was I wanted to create a Dark Tower guide to Manhattan, because there are so many locations in Manhattan that are mentioned throughout the series. And so I finally put that together and I drew my map and talked about all the locations. And then I said, I'm going to try to draw a map of Midworld, which is difficult because time dilations, distance dilations, things move around. King isn't always the most concerned about consistency. But I found a detail in The Wind Through the Keyhole, which made the whole thing possible. And that was where Gilead is really located, that it's on the North Beam. And once I was able to put Gilead in, and I drew a line west, it all started to connect. And so I've got a map of, sort of the upper quadrant, the only known section we have, but to me is pretty self-consistent with everything. So I like that. I have a little map on the wall here that somebody did, that they sell them on Etsy, which is really cool, but I'm saying, well, that's not right. No, that's not right.
You got the right one. You got the right one. Well, more than 10 years passes by since the last time Steve King returned to Midworld, and he never really closes that door. From time to time, we hear him say that he still has a couple of stories to tell. For example, of course, the most, the one that we are looking for the most is the Battle of Jericho Hill. He also mentioned once the story of Arthur, and the third one I got a record, of course, is thanks to you and your book, where thanks to that glimpse we got in the interview you did with Stephen King, well, we talked, you asked him about Roland's sister, Clarissa, and that he said, no, I won't tell anything else at first, but then he said that the one person that knows everything about Roland's past is Everline at Serenity. Everline. So there might be a story focus on this as well. Did you ever discuss this with King on these last years? Do you think he will return?
I first noticed the passage in Wizard and Glass where Roland is he's had his night out after he beat court, and he went and slept with the prostitute and got drunk, and his father comes to him and he looks at his son, the one who had lived, words to that effect. And I thought, and so I asked Steve about that when I was working on The Road to the Dark Tower, and I didn't bother him that much when I was working The Road to the Dark Tower, but every now and then I'd ask him some very specific questions, and he wrote back and he said, "You're one smart Canadian." And so he gave me a little bit of information then, and then I quizzed him on it again years later. But no, to be honest, we think about this stuff a whole lot more than he does. And so he talks about, okay, I wonder what Holly's doing these days, or I wonder what happened to Father Callahan. But he's only wondering. And to find out about those things, he has to sit down and write. And so maybe someday he'll wonder, what does Sister Evelyn really know? And maybe he'll sit down and do that. Or maybe he'll wonder, what really did happen at Jericho Hill? But I don't think that it's top of mind most of the time. He's now thinking maybe, what happened at the end of the Black House? That's sort of maybe in his future. He calls it part of his active file. And so I think it's things that he's thinking about now a little bit more deliberately. But yeah, we'll see.
These days, of course, for last 9 months already, we are waiting. We got the news that Mike Flanagan will be adapting The Dark Tower for a third time, and we hope the definitive one. But how are your expectations on this project, on this third?
I mean, Mike's clearly somebody who knows his king. He tends to be respectful of the material, but also open to experimenting, as we saw with Dr. Sleep. I mean, there was a case where he was in a potentially complex situation and he found a way to untie the Gordian knot without cutting it in what I thought was a satisfactory way.
It's amazing. Dr. Sleep was amazing.
Yeah. I don't really know what his big picture plan is. Yeah, I did like what Ron Howard and Akiva Goldsman conceptualized, which was to use the cinema for the big stories, the huge, action pieces, and then to write, 10-episode limited series for some of the more intimate, character-driven components. I like that idea a lot. And I think we can see the after effects of that in the movie that we did get, which is somebody realized that the Gunslinger is probably not the best place to start introducing movie audiences to this series, because it is a little bit, there's not a lot that happens.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is internal. I mean, there's some very bloody battles and some things like that happen, but in terms of like dropping people into this world and getting them going, and I can see why they did what they did. And I think that even when Ron Howard and Akiva Goldsman were talking about, they really wanted to start from Jake in New York as the sort of launching point. But and then we have what Glenn Mazzara was hoping to do, which was to start from the chronological beginning, which is go back to Roland as a teenager and the adventures of Wizard and Glass, tell that story chronologically, which certainly had merit. And I'm really sad that we haven't gotten to see the results of what he did. Some people have, but I haven't. So yeah, and it's a daunting project. I don't think it's something that anyone would handle lightly. Whether we'll, given all the tumult that's been going on in Hollywood lately, the new contract for the writers, the actors are still on strike, what the landscape is going to look like for new projects moving forward once this is all resolved is still an unanswered question. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah, you mentioned the strike, and I read this last week that the deal for writers is now almost signed, and we're still the actors still have the strike going on. And I remember that thanks to a strike in the 80s, we got Pet Cemetery basically, because so my expectation for this strike was that let's hope they finally release Salem's Lot.
You know, my feeling is that if they were going to do it, they would have done it by now. I really think that, you know, there was another one of the DC movies,
Batgirl.
Supergirl, something or other, that they just decided to take a tax write-off and just throw it in the trash. With no evidence, just my own feeling, I think that's going to happen to Salem's Lot too. I've heard enough critique of it from people who've seen it to say that maybe it's not what we wanted to see.
Okay.
Maybe, I don't know. I really don't know, but I've heard some negative commentary on it that I think maybe that I'd be surprised that, because they've had a lot of time to put it out, and you know, why they would suddenly decide to now, I don't know, unless they're really desperate. You know, like I said, if the actors stay on strike and there's nothing new in the pipeline,
that it wasn't that bad.
It wasn't that bad, yeah.
Of course. All right. Your first direct relationship with Stephen King was when he contacted. I read this on an interview, of course, that he contacted you through his office, so you could read the script of Asylum, no, a screenplay he wrote, and you could tell him you're already working on writing the columns, news from the dead zone, and you could tell him if it was boring or not, since someone on the net said it was kind of boring. And since this story remains unpublished until today, what can you tell us about this? And do you like it?
So Asylum is based on a novel by Patrick McGrath. I think King got to know McGrath. I think McGrath was in Maine at some point. Maybe he had a summer home there or something. They talked about this story. King decided to write a script for it. The script got into the hands of, I want to say it was Quint at Ain't It Cool News, who wrote about it. And so in one of my News from the Dead Zone columns, I quoted what Quint had said. And I think that probably one of the worst things that anybody could ever say about Steve's work from his point of view is that something was boring. And so I think he was a little bit wounded by that, perhaps. And so he sent me the screenplay for my commentary. Now, I had read the novel. It's a difficult novel because it involves people doing stupid things, like, or just making bad life choices. And so I wrote back to him and said, definitely not boring, but it's sort of discouraging story. But it's interesting because somebody recently approached me and said, oh, you know, do you still have a copy of that? You know, I'd love to read it. And I was thinking, I haven't seen that for a long time. And, you know, I can't put my hands on it. It's in the house somewhere, but I thought I knew exactly where it was, and I just can't put my hands on it. So it may remain lost.
It happens. It happens.
But you're right. That really did start the earliest of my sort of correspondence with King. But even back then, it was very infrequent. I couldn't tell you exactly when that accelerated to the way it is now, but it was a gradual process. Because, you know, both Richard Chismer and I, we sort of pinch each other and slap each other in the cheeks and say, you know, we've got this relationship that is built with somebody, you know, in 1979 when I was reading Salem's Lot, or, you know, you never could have imagined that this could possibly have happened. But things happen.
It happened.
Happened.
Yeah, you were also a pen pal with Tabitha.
That actually started first, really. In the 1990s, when the internet was starting to develop, and there were places for people to go, people migrated from these old computer bulletin boards into something called Usenet. And the King news group was really, really active. There was a Peter Straub group, which was, post every couple of days. And there was a John Grisham one that nobody ever posted in. But the King one, there was like dozens and dozens of people every day writing about his books and what's coming and what about this book and who do you think this character is and all that stuff. So I was pretty active in that. And Tabitha King was a quasi lurker, because I think she was trying to see for herself what this internet thing was all about. What does it mean? What are people saying? And I tended to come off as a bit of a know-it-all. I always look up details if somebody asked a question, and so I was always answering questions. And I have a sort of confident way of saying things. And I confidently said that Tabitha King's first novel was a paperback original. And I got this email saying, oh, no, it wasn't. It came out as a hardcover. And the email address it came from, it wasn't obvious who it was. It was like back in those days, people like, I have an email address still, it's maxdevore@hotmail.com. But I guessed that it was Tabitha. And we started emailing back and forth for quite a number of years, mostly about family stuff. I had a young daughter, she had raised some kids, and we talked about family and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, that was fun.
You met her once in Bangor, went to Steve King's house as well. Oh, amazing. That
was late 97. At the end of the year, my wife and I were traveling back to Canada to visit my family. And I just said to Tabitha that, I'll be in Bangor on this day, and, maybe we can meet up and have coffee or something. And we got in fairly late in the afternoon, and my wife and I went out and had dinner. We were going to go see a movie, but we stopped off at the hotel first for some reason or other. And when we were going up the stairs, the guy behind the desk said, "Were you expecting to hear from Tabitha King?" And he said, "Well, here's her phone number. She wants you to call her." And so we called, and she invited us over to the house. And so we spent the evening mostly talking to her. Steve and Owen were out at a cribbage tournament. And Steve got beat out first, so he came home, and so he was around the house. And then we had to go back to pick up Owen, so I rode with Steve back to pick up Owen. And then Steve and Tabby took my wife and I to the office. And we got to see all the stuff that was there. And we went into one of the things I always remember, we went into the back office where he had all of his foreign translations. It's just like stacks and stacks of all the books in different languages. And we were playing this game. What book do you think this is? And it would have like a Bulgarian title that you couldn't even pronounce the title. And we were guessing this and that. And so that was fun. And that's when he gave me the copy of 6 stories that he inscribed. So yes, definitely a memorable evening.
Very nice. Very nice.
The thing that strikes me that's current, relevant today is at the end of the evening, he was going to go upstairs to watch something with his boys, because both Joe and Owen were there. And he invited us to go watch with him. But I said to him, well, I think we've, stayed long enough. We don't want to outstay our welcome and that. But the thing he was going to go watch with them was The Singing Detective, with the actor that just died this week, Michael Gambon.
Michael Gambon,
yeah. And so that's he was going to go watch that Michael Gambon series that night. And, but yeah, we bowed out that night and didn't stay to watch the show.
Talking about great evenings, as you said, there is one particular where this book idea came up, right? This is the book that you and him edited, both of you, Flight of Fright in Spanish. You have it published in Spanish. It's called Por los Aires. through the years. You'd be
Yep.
the textual translation. What can you tell us about this book?
17 translations so far.
Very nice.
Which is pretty cool. And I don't have all of them, but I have a number of them, and that's pretty cool. Yeah, that was being in the right place at the right time. I was invited to go to Bangor for the world premiere of the Dark Tower movie. And a lot of people were invited in. Robin Firth was there. Richard Chismar was there with his two boys. Some people from Sony had come in from California. And the first part of the evening was a dinner at Nick's Cruise and Diner, which was right across from the airport. And Bangor is not the easiest place in America to get to. It's sort of way up in the corner and small planes. And so you always have to make at least one connection. And so we all had travel experiences that we were talking about. Oh, I lost my luggage, or oh, I had to wait 2 hours here, or I missed a connection, or whatever. And so Steve was going around talking to people, and he had just finished reading The Horror of the Heights by Conan Doyle. And the idea just came to him in that moment. He said, we should gather up all of the short stories that have been written about the experiences of travel, of flying specifically. And I was sitting with Richard Chismar and his boys. And so Steve comes tearing over to Richard, and he says, oh, I've got this idea. And he said, you can publish it. And then he stops and he says, but, I'm going to need a little bit of help finding all these stories. And he looks at me and he says, that can be your job. And so two things occurred to me in that moment. One was, if I'd been off in the bathroom or off talking to somebody else might have gotten that nomination. And the other one was he really serious? And so after that evening, when I came back to Texas, I proceeded as if he had been serious. And I started finding stories. So I sent him a few, and then he sort of caught on, and he started sending me some, and we worked through this project together, which it was really cool. The original idea was that we were going to use the Langoliers, which in Stephen King land is a novella, but for any other writer, it's a 100,000 word novel. And the whole anthology is like 170,000 words or something like that. It would have dominated the book. And so at a certain point, he said, the people at my publisher are a little bit hesitant about letting us use the Langoliers. What do you think about if I write a new story? And I'm thinking, no, Steve, please don't write a new story. That won't help the book at all. And so he came up with the Turbulence Expert, which is actually something based on something that he talked about many years before. So it's another one of these ideas that had been rolling around in his mind that he finally put down in words.
I wasn't aware he talked about that before.
Yeah, I'll have to go back. After the anthology came out, at some point I found an interview where he talked about that concept from back in the 80s, I think, or the 90s at least. So it just goes to prove ideas can sort of sit around for a while until their moment comes. And so then he wrote the introductions to all of the stories. And I remember one in particular, he'd send them one at a time to me. I was maintaining the manuscript. And there was one night when he was in Maine, probably in the wintertime, when the power went out. And so he wrote it by hand, and then he scanned it and sent me the scan of the handwritten introduction. I think it was for Roald Dahl's story. But then he asked me to write the introduction to my story. And then I wrote the afterword, and he wrote the introduction. And the introduction to me is the scariest story in the whole book. His near-death experience and his charter plane almost got flipped upside down by a close encounter with a big plane. But yeah, I mean, that was just a fantastic experience. We got a little bit of criticism because it's not a very diverse authors list. It's all men, all white men. But to be honest, we pretty much strip mined the genre. And, our criterion was previously published. So it wasn't like we were asking people to write new stories. Although, people said, well, Steve wrote a new story and Joe Hill wrote a new story, but that was late in the game. That wasn't our intention. But to be honest, I haven't yet subsequently found anything else except for one story that if I had thought about it, we would have included, and it was a Rick Howdala story that was in Cemetery Dance.
Okay.
Another white guy, so it wouldn't have improved our diversity at all. But yeah, that was one of the big criticisms we got from it.
It's a really cool book. I enjoyed it a lot.
Some great stories. I mean, as soon as I read Michael Lewis's story, that I said this is going to be the first one in the collection because, man, what a haunting story. And I wasn't familiar with him at that point. I hadn't read, and he hasn't written a whole lot, I think. But some stories came to mind immediately. Obviously, you got to do the Matheson story. But then we found that one Lucifer, which the British audiences probably knew better the author of that story and his story, but I'd never even heard of the guy before. And then Owen King suggested one of the stories, and yes, we got a lot of feedback from other people.
Besides all the books we talked about so far, you also wrote and published several short stories through time. Can you tell us more when you started working on fiction and your first publishing ones? And these days, I mean, I follow you on Facebook, and you have a lot of news.
So what you see behind me are mostly anthologies and things that have my stories in them. I've published probably 130 stories up to now. The first one, so I wrote some when I was in college. I wrote a bunch of short stories after reading Night Shift, and I was really inspired to write short stories that were like Night Shift stories. But I didn't do anything with them. I just read them to my friends in college dorm. And I didn't write for a long time when I started my work career. But around about 1999 or so, I decided that I wanted to start writing again, fiction. And I set myself a resolution. I said, I want to get something published by the end of 2000. And I did. I think I got my first acceptance at the end of 1999, but my first published story was in 2000. I won a short story contest with a story called Harming Obsession. And since then, I've kept writing short stories. I have some bucket list markets that I've always been targeting. I got published in Cemetery Dance. I was really happy when I got one in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, and then in Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine, and I've had another one since then in Alfred Hitchcock. And I have one that hasn't been formally accepted yet, but because of this AI deluge that they're getting, they're just getting swamped by AI generated stories. It's really bogged a lot of them down. But it's another one of my bucket list markets that Steve published in his early days. But yeah, a lot of stories. One novella, well, let's say two novellas. One in a book called Dissonant Harmonies that I did a project with Brian Keane. And that one's got the longest piece of fiction that I've published so far, a novella called The Dead of Winter. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, I thought, let me play around with self-publishing. So I had this story that had gotten too long really to be published anywhere. And so I rewrote it, and I figured out how to format it, and I made an Amazon Kindle ebook and paperback version of this thing called The Ogilvy Affair, which I self-published, and I was very happy with that. But you've really got to get out there and push those things to get some traction with them. And every now and then I'll find out somebody in Australia bought a copy and somebody in England bought a copy, and so it's out there. But
yeah,
that's just fun.
Self-publishing involves a lot of pushing. You have to constantly remind people about it. And then
even with the anthologies, there's always anthologies. And the last couple of years I've been in a lot of anthologies, and every one of them you feel like you need to help push the anthology, but then sometimes it's just there's so many of them. I think, what story did I have in that one again? Oh yeah, that one.
Ever consider writing a novel?
I've written a lot of novels. maybe 6 or 7. The first, I have my agent shopped one around a number of years ago, and it didn't get picked up anywhere. I have another one right now that he's got in submission, which I really, really like. I really hope that we can get a bite on it. Brian Freeman at Cemetery Dance is like my big cheerleader on this one. He really likes this one, and Rich Chismar's read it, and it's I'd really love to get this one published. But I've got sort of 2 different kinds. I've got some horror-ish ones, and then I've got some private detective novels as well. And one of my ideals would be to get into like a 1-a-year mode that a lot of crime fiction writers get into, like Michael Connelly and people like that. And you've got a series character and you can just do different. I'd love to get into that mode, but haven't yet hit that sweet spot yet.
Last year, we got this beauty, Stephen King, a complete exploration of his works, life, and influence. And this book, compared to the previous Stephen King Illustrated Companion, this one covers all Stephen King books, and adaptations, his life. And in the interludes, I really love the interludes. I mean, the poetry, dairy, Castle Rock. My first question, it's a joke, is what magic did you do to put all the books by Stephen King into 240 pages only?
Well, yeah, the trick is to write a lot about some of them and a little bit about others. Really, my interest, the title is his work, life, and influences. And that order to me is very deliberate. My primary focus is on the work. But what really interests me is which parts of his life are manifested in those books. What was the thing that happened that led to that novel? What was the inspiration? And for a lot of books, there are very interesting stories that you can tell about something that happened in his life. He went out to pick up his car, and a dog attacked him. Just there are things, because the big question people always ask is, where do you get your ideas? And that's like the big question that nobody can answer. But where did you get the idea for that book? And there's always a story for that. And that was what I always researched for this new book. So one example I like to talk about is Billy Summers. The flash of inspiration for that one was a vision he had of somebody in a basement apartment seeing feet walk by the window. And he said, why is that guy there? Why is he in that circumstance? And it then cascaded into this book about the hitman on his last day of work. And, Holly, 2 things that inspired him. A COVID funeral. And the whole thing about COVID itself. But there's always like moments that he puts together. And then sometimes those moments aren't even that important to the final book. Like the scene in Billy Summers is sort of incidental, but it's the seed that got planted. And
Exactly.
As somebody who myself, I can go back and look at, why did I write that story? What happened to bring these things together? That is what really interests me about writing about somebody else's work.
What is your favorite of all these seeds? Of course, King has hundreds, probably close to thousands, but one that you said, okay, this one stuck to my mind and I could never forget it.
Well, I mean, the obvious one is The Shining. The fact that he had insomnia and he wandered the hallways and he kept seeing things that became iconic, seeing the folded up fire hose and having a flash of it coming to life. But I think one of my favorite stories is how he came to write Misery, being on the airplane and having this dream that came to him. And he's flying to London. And when he gets there, again, he's got insomnia. He wants to work in this thing, and he goes to the concierge at the hotel and says, is there a quiet place where I can work? And so he goes off and he sits down and writes the, however many pages he wrote. And then he goes back to the concierge, and the guy tells him, oh yeah, that was where Kipling worked, and he died at that desk. That's like, if that story's true, and King's a great storyteller, who knows how much of it is,
yeah, of course.
but it's a great story. It's just a great story.
Yeah, I remember he wrote an introduction for Lovecraft Against Life. I don't remember, Michael Vick. And he told in that intro, he talked about this potential story he had in mind once, that he ran by a store and there was this pillow, and the seller assured it was the pillow Lovecraft used. So let's imagine one person has this pillow and has these horrible nightmares. Who knows?
I have some friends who have adapted that idea into a short film.
I saw one short film about that years ago, like 15 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, Mark Steensland was my roommate.
Yeah, Mark Steensland.
Him and Rick Houtala got together and developed that into a short film. Yeah.
I didn't know you were involved in that one. I do remember.
I'm not involved. I just know them. Yeah.
You were involved. You wrote a script for what I think the most famous Dollar Baby, which is Stephen King's God and Cafe. I mean, the only one that has Stephen King's name, and also a cameo from him as well, a voice cameo. Yep. I don't know if you know, but that Dollar Baby, we started here in Buenos Aires in 2006. That. Yeah, and Julie Sands, who was the star of the film, came here and presented in a theater. It was really, really cool experience.
And she and I presented it to King in the theater in Bangor.
Whoa!
He rented out the movie theater that day, and he had a couple of friends along with him, and they sat up front and ate popcorn and watched the movie, and we sat in the back and watched them watching the movie.
It's a really great short film. It's a great, super professional. I remember Big Gary's also has a cameo there. Don't forget the face of your fathers, he says. Yeah.
Steve Wozniak, the guy who from Apple Computers.
More than 20 years passed since you started writing News from the Dead Zone for Cemetery Dance. And even in these social media days where that demands every news to be right on, right there, right now, and cannot wait for the next magazine, cannot wait for the time that a magazine requires. It's really nice for me, I mean, to enter and read the new columns and everything. And I think you still enjoy working on that columns, right? It's been more than 20 years, and you can.
Yeah. And then we have the online version, which is for the people who need to have up-to-date information. But even that one, I if I do 2 or 3 of those a year. Now, I used to do a lot more in the early days with the online, but now if the pace has slowed down, King's only putting out a book a year. There's not any short stories. We went through a period of really good adaptations, but I feel like we're into a period now where the quality is not quite as good as it has been in the recent past. So there's just not as much to write about. So every year I write an essay for Dave Hinchberger at the Overlook Connection for his calendar. And I summarize what happened in the previous year and then what we can look forward to the next year. And I always end with a list of all the adaptations that have been announced. And then the next year, I look back and say, I listed 15. One of them got made into a movie. Here are the next 15.
Yeah, it happens like that. I mean, I'm still waiting. There are projects that hurt. I was really looking for when the Reach was announced back in 2012 in Cannes, and also Joyland, that was supposed to be adapted by Tate Taylor. Oh my god, that one hurt. Those are the projects that, well, it happens. You are also involved in Stephen King Revisit. Richard Cheeseman I don't know if he still is, reading every single Stephen King book in order. And you contributed with historical context and anecdotes and writings about it. The last one I remember was The Eyes of the Dragon, I think.
Eyes of the Dragon, that's the last one.
Yeah. Are there any plans? I know there is a book coming. Are there any plans to continue?
I have 6 more essays written on the dashboard, waiting for Richard to get back to the project.
All right.
Richard has been very busy with his own novels lately, the Gwendy series and now his Boogeyman books. Every time I have an opportunity, I say, "So, Rich, when's the next one coming?"
Yeah.
I hope so. I really hope so, because it's been a fun project. But yeah, the book has everything that's been published up to now. There has been galleys produced of it, but I don't know exactly when the book itself is going to come out.
All right. This is our last question, so I don't take you any more time. You mentioned your favorite book by Stephen King is Bag of Bones, and it's the one that you would recommend to a newcomer. Why? It's an interesting book to choose, I think.
Yeah. So I think that I was under the misapprehension that Steve's style changed dramatically when he moved to Scribner, that he became more literary. And obviously Bag of Bones is a very literary novel. The literary references, it's just absolutely full of them. I love that it's a first-person novel from the perspective of a writer. And the audiobook, he reads the audiobook, so it feels like Steve's sitting here telling me about his life almost. It's not his life, but so there was that aspect to it. But over the course of the last several months, I have been introducing Stephen King's books to my wife. Now, she's not a horror fan, but there are many things that I can read to her that are not horror novels. And we started with Fairy Tale, which she just loved. And then I read Billy Summers, which she also loved. And then I went back and read The Body. And I was pleasantly surprised to be reminded by how literary the writing in that novella is from back in the early 80s. And it made me sort of stop to question my assumption that he's become more literary. He's always been literary. He always has. And my wife just says his writing is poetic, even back in those days. And, reading Holly, there's this interlude in there where Barbara talks to her mentor, and there's this like rich discussion about the importance of poetry. And I wrote an essay several years ago. The Poetry Foundation approached me and they wanted me to write an essay about Stephen King's relationship to poetry. And so I did a lot of research. I got some of the rare unpublished poems. And Steve would never, ever pretend that his poetry is in the same league as his prose. But during the writing of that essay, I realized how crucial poetry is to just about everything that he's written. Characters are constantly quoting poetry if they're not writing it themselves. There's the famous haiku from it, but Guard in Tommyknockers is a poet, and there's so many characters who are poets or who are conversant with poetry. And then you start reading Steve's interviews, and he'll just toss off, some lines from some poem, and sometimes they're well known, and sometimes they're not. And you realize he cut his teeth on poetry. His college education was heavily poetry influenced, and so still going back to Bag of Bones, I just love that book. And I look at it with Lisey's story as bookends. You have the novelist who's just lost his wife. You've got the novelist wife who's just lost her novelist husband. Those are, to me, just a perfect companion piece. Long answer to your question, sorry.
No, good. Excellent. You were talking about poetry. I unless I'm wrong, I think Kerry White also.
Yes.
So we have the first published character, not of his first novel, but the first published one. And also we have in Holly
Yes.
The Barbara also has these poetry sessions with her new mentor, who was
And then there's that old couple in Herman Wouk is still alive.
Oh, that was my favorite short story by Stephen King, the one that gets me the most. Yeah, as well.
So there's a lot of poets in there, a lot of poetry, and a lot of poetry in to begin the sections of each book, and of course the Dark Tower was influenced so strongly by poem, and it's everywhere, and I don't think people really appreciate that.
So Stephen King interviewed you. You have a friend relationship with him. You edited one book. You wrote about him. Is there anything that you would like to do with him or about him that you haven't achieved yet?
There's one thing it's on my active list. He talks in a couple of interviews about this short story idea that he had, that he can tell the story up to a certain point and then he can't figure out what happened next.
Ladies Room.
Yes. I have an idea. I haven't pitched the idea to him yet, but I would like to carve out some time and try to make that story work.
Good luck. I was definitely in for that. Yeah, good luck. Bev, where can our audience read more from you, your news, your projects? How can they follow you?
So bevvincent.com is my author central. You can find out about all my books and short stories and essays and interviews and all that stuff. I'm on Facebook, but not so active there. I'm on Twitter. You have to be forewarned that I'm very political on Twitter. So, but that's my main platform at present. I'm on Blue Sky, which is the new social media platform where a lot of writers who fled Twitter have moved to. I have an Instagram, which I don't do that much on, but every now and then. I think I'm on Threads, but I don't know what to do with Threads.
Like everyone else.
Yeah, I'm pretty much everywhere. But,
all right. I can thank you for all your time and this great interview. I enjoyed it a lot, and I look forward to hear more from you, as always. I also, since I share your political views, I'm on Twitter. Yeah, go. I concur with all that.
But the funny thing is that it was a risk. But I had, a few hundred, maybe 1,000 or so followers. And then when I started getting political, I started getting a lot of followers. And it's
thank you very much. And well, we'll talk very soon.
Okay, thank you. My pleasure.
¿Te gustó? ¿No te gustó? Bueno, se contó de todo. Yo quedé completamente fascinado. Tuve que dejar un par de preguntas afuera porque nada, no daba el tiempo, porque ya nos habíamos pasado un montón. Así que bueno, contanos qué te pareció. Nos vemos muy pronto.